Hello and welcome to Radio Britannia with me, Charlie Downs.
And me, Alice Grant. We were so overwhelmed and humbled by the immensely positive response we received for the first episode, and we're very pleased today to bring you a new show where we are going to be covering many topics from the tragic Huntingdon attacks to the BBC's editing of Trump, and of course, Nigel Farage and the Reform Party.
Alice, nowhere in this country is safe. In literally the last week alone, we've had the senseless murder of Wayne Broadhurst in Uxbridge, stabbing of a 14-year-old boy in Peterborough, and most recently, on Saturday night, the stabbing of 10 people on a train in Huntingdon. And I was on the train this morning, and I had my head on the swivel, and there was a real tension in the air. I think people are really, for one thing, sick and tired of living this way, but also scared. I think people are really worried, particularly if they have children, or if they have a sister, or, about the state of law and order in this country, because it feels to me like the country is a tinderbox and nowhere feels safe. How do you feel about this?
I agree with you entirely. Nothing's ever been more dangerous. Public transport, shopping, on our streets, in London especially. As a young woman, I certainly don't feel safe. I think pepper spray should be legalised, frankly, because, young men such as yourself can defend yourselves. But for people who are more vulnerable, it's a real crisis in safety. And whilst that is ultimately the fault of the government for failing time and time again to make the necessary precautions in ensuring safety and that our streets are safe and that our public transports are spaces of safety, it's a real failure on their part. I also think that there are several incidents which can't be directly attributed to Keir Starmer's policy failings, but I think in this instance we can look to the government and say, what are they doing about this? Which brings me on to an interesting point which I wanted to discuss with you. The government often sees, as a response to these sorts of situations, an increase in security. What if they want to introduce airport-style security on trains? It always seems to be an opportunity to increase the surveillance state, to add more measures to ensure that, we're all patted down and made sure that we don't have any knives on us. Is that the right response to these kind of situations? What do you think?
As with so many issues in this country, our ruling class seems committed to treating symptoms as opposed to addressing the root cause of these things. I think that is a prime example of that, because there already has been discourse about one remedy to this crime explosion that we're seeing in the country. By the way, there were crime statistics released the other week that suggested we are in the midst of a crime wave. And these horrible atrocities that have happened literally in the last week certainly seem to point to that. And already there is talk of the introduction of knife arches at train stations and, as you say, patting down of passengers and all this kind of thing. And sure, that may prevent further incidents like this happening, but is that the kind of country we want to live in? Do we want to live in a police state where our every move is monitored and where we can't walk our streets and use public transport in a way that is not sort of interrupted by the presence of the state? I think that if the government was serious about this, they'd be looking at the causes of these problems. I think there's a number of those. I think one is a total failure in policing. A lot of places feel as though they are lawless now. It feels as though there is no police presence there. And there is, of course, the obvious criticism that they're too busy policing speech on the internet, which is certainly a problem. But there's also, I think, a general deterioration in the quality of police. I think the number of, for example, women that we see in frontline positions does not create a sense of safety. And I think that, criminally minded, thuggish, murderous individuals, of whom there seem to be quite a lot in our country now, are going to look at that and think, well, I can probably get away with committing a crime here. And moreover, the police in this country increasingly feel like a hostile presence themselves. I think a lot of people view the police not as being members of their community and integrated into the daily fabric of life, but as alien kind of agents of the state. And I think the uniform the police have nowadays, the kind of high-vis look, is part of this. I think they look clownish and unserious dressed like that. And I think the training that they get and the standards that they have to meet physically certainly seem to be inadequate, because all over the world our police force is regarded as a bit of a joke.
Yeah, well, I don't think necessarily having women on the front line is what's putting off crime, but I do agree that there are serious questions as to where policing resources are best used. You mentioned the scandal of people having their tweets taken down, having the police turned up because they said something on the internet. How is that happening concurrently with this crime epidemic in our capital city? So that's a serious issue. Another thing you mentioned, which I thought was quite interesting, was the idea about this moving towards the sort of more French gendarme style of policing, where they have batons and high vis and they look like they're about to crush any poor protester. But of course, you've seen the introduction of the Public Order Act 2023, which has caused a lot of conversation, because there's this now very low threshold for where it is acceptable for police to intervene, i.e., any protest which is considered more than minor. Of course, there's a lot of debate as to what those words actually mean. And in this case, is that acceptable?
Well, I think bad law is definitely part of this. And the laws, or crimes rather, that police are instructed to prioritise is a huge problem, because it's such a stereotype now in this country that if you are the victim of a burglary or a mugging, for example, as I have been in the last couple of months, I got my phone stolen in London. You know, the police are never ever gonna solve those crimes in a lot of situations. There's almost, you report the crime to the police, but there's never any expectation that it's going to be solved, right?
That's so true. It happened to me. My phone was taken from me at Green Park. The police don't do anything about it. And I think whilst you can understand to some extent, okay, a phone is stolen, there's not much you can do, it really eroded trust in policing for me, because I just felt like, well, what are they here for if they're not actually looking into crime, if they're not at least providing some sort of constellation that will actually do something about this crime epidemic? And of course, for the people who are stealing the phones of young individuals such as ourselves, they can get away with it plainly. And we've seen, the issues with the delivery bike riders, people on mopeds. London is a city which no one feels safe anymore.
And again, the country at large is also this way, because in thinking about what is being prioritised in terms of police time, you mentioned pepper spray earlier, which I think is very interesting, because the right to self-defence, which has been every Englishman's right, for time immemorial, has been completely eroded in this country. It is impossible to defend yourself and not receive repercussions, from the law. Because on the topic of pepper spray specifically, possession of pepper spray carries the same sentence as possession of a handgun in this country. It's unbelievable. And yet, so many young women feel like my wife, for example. We were having a conversation last night about how she doesn't feel safe traveling, certainly into London, but actually just urban centres in general, because they feel so dangerous. They feel so lawless. And I think if young women specifically were permitted to carry something like pepper spray, I think that it would do a hell of a lot of good for the sort of mindset of this country, and I think it would also prevent crime, because I think we see an unbelievable amount of sexual assault and horrible crimes inflicted upon the young women of Britain, and I think if they had a means of defending themselves, then that would be great. But is this government ever going to do that? No, I don't think they are, because again, their response to these kinds of problems is just to ramp up the presence of the security state.
Exactly. So our conclusion is more pepper spray and no arches or weird beepy machines when we pass through security. Something I did want to say, though, is that despite the horror of the Huntingdon attack, there were some wonderful British heroes who stood up and who bravely defended those who they could see were in danger, which I think is just testament to, despite everything and the place that we're in as a society at the moment, there is hope. I know that, should there be some sort of awful attack, we're not the kind of society where we're going to abandon everyone next to us and just, each man for himself, but that there are heroes like, I think, the wonderful Steve, and also the train driver, Andrew Johnson, who really thought in that moment, what is the best for the people in danger at the moment? How can I protect and save lives?
Yeah. The British are mostly asleep, but we do every now and then get roused from our slumber. That's for sure.
Give them a medal. Moving on to our next topic, Charlie and I were both quite shocked at this ridiculous clip that we saw from the BBC, reported by The Telegraph, in which Trump's video speech, in which he was talking about the Capitol and trying to rouse the American people, was clipped so that it made it look like he was directly inciting violence. In fact, the two clips were taken from entirely different points in the speech, but wielded together in a way that made it look like he was being, frankly, quite dangerous in his rhetoric. This was not the case at all, and he went on in the original clip to say in the next line to cheerfully promote congressmen and women, and they in fact made it look like he was saying to fight till the death on the Capitol.
So yeah, this was in the immediate precursor to the 2020 Capitol Hill riot, so-called. And yeah, it's unbelievable, this clip. The BBC, as you say, presented it in a way that suggested he was inciting his followers to engage in the kinds of scenes that we saw on that particular occasion. And, I don't think either of us would endorse the behaviour on that day. I think there's a lot of questions around it. I think that a lot of things that happened on that day were, they certainly merit further investigation.
Not from the BBC.
Well, no, but the presence of intelligence services in the crowd and that kind of thing. But anyway, this story in particular, though, about the way the BBC presented this, I think is it embodies so much of what is wrong with what I call regime media, is that they just blatantly lie. And it's no wonder so many ordinary members of the public have completely lost faith in platforms like the BBC. Now, it is the case that the BBC is still viewed and trusted by a huge number of people. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think in a lot of ways, a national broadcaster is something that is entirely appropriate for Britain to have. I think the BBC as an institution could be, if it was led by the right people, a very good thing for the national interest.
Well, once it was. We mentioned earlier that they have wonderful archival footage, which always brings a smile to my face. They produce great documentaries on nature and the planet, and I have to say I do love a good David Attenborough documentary. But the real crisis here is the political investigative journalism. And in this case, this was supposed to be a panorama film, and what we're receiving is, frankly, misinformation.
It's propaganda.
It's absolute outright lies.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned rightly, Charlie, that can the British people put their faith in a national broadcaster which is willing to use very sneaky methods to chop and put together clips in order to convey a very particular ideologically driven message which has no basis in truth?
Well, I think it comes back to the something we discussed on the last episode, which is the ideology that rules our country at the moment, which has infected every arm of our state, which includes and in fact is embodied by the BBC in a lot of ways. Because if you look on the BBC these days at the kind of programming that they're producing, we looked earlier and they've got a program out, I think it's a Panorama documentary called Is the Church Racist? And they've got, well, if you look up the phrase, is X racist on BBC iPlayer, there's literally like a dozen different things of, is this racist? Is that racist? Is the other racist? Right? And if you look again at the kind of causes and interest groups that they are seeking to platform with their programming, in every case, it is fringe minority interests, whether it's LGBTQ issues or, things around immigration and immigrant groups and this kind of thing. And it's just not the kind of thing that ordinary people care about. And in a lot of ways, it feels as though the interests of ordinary British people in this country are absolutely not being represented or serviced by the BBC. And in a marketplace, I suspect the BBC would go under because nobody is interested in these programs. But obviously, they're propped up by our tax money, which means they carry on doing this stuff.
Exactly. I mean, BBC Panorama in particular has, supposed to cover scandals such as the grooming gang scandal or international war, and yet they've been embroiled in both circumstances in scandals in which they have plainly violated their one mission, which should be to tell us the truth plainly and to actually educate the British people, which is what we want. We want to be able to receive information and a good analysis, which just sadly isn't the case anymore. Charlie, do you think that the call to defund the BBC is a little harsh? Where do you stand on this?
Well, I don't think it's harsh. I think it's completely justified because the BBC, as I said, does not serve the public interest. In fact, they are very much against the public interest and act as a essentially vector of indoctrination of the general public because, as I said, plenty of people are still watching BBC News and getting their opinions about the world from that programme. And those are opinions which are, in my view, completely ideologically driven, completely out of touch with reality.
Do you think it makes a difference that Tim Davies is general director?
Well, I mean, the guy's supposed to be a conservative, but their output is not, in any way conservative. And I wouldn't expect it to be, because the regime that they act as a mouthpiece for is itself not conservative in any way. And this is the point that we have to understand about the BBC, in my opinion. This idea that they're going to be some kind of impartial, objective broadcaster, I think is a fantasy. I think there is no such thing as neutrality when it comes to matters of politics. And the BBC is obviously a political organisation because it's an arm of the state, right? And so I would prefer that we were honest about what the BBC actually is, which is that it is the mouthpiece of the state. And so this, then we can take it one step back and say, well, if it's the mouthpiece of the state, what we want is a good state, a well-governed state that acts in the interests of ordinary people. And downstream from that will come a BBC, which similarly acts in the interests of ordinary people. And I think if we were to get a patriotic government, quite frankly, the BBC would be a good thing. And so I don't think we should be seeking to destroy the BBC. I think we should be seeking to recapture the BBC.
I like that. So it comes from top down. The real root issue is an establishment which for decades has fundamentally not served the interests of the British public or treated us as sheeple who will just be easily fed a narrative and buy into it. Not so much for at least us.
Well, it is interesting because obviously we had a Conservative government for 14 years, allegedly. But I think it is a damning indictment of modern conservatism that they took really no interest in matters of culture.
Yeah.
The Conservative Party of David Cameron was an entirely economic project. All they talked about, all they cared about was growth and the GDP and the economy and all this sort of thing. And this has been a problem, in my view, since Thatcher, where Conservatives have withdrawn from matters of culture and kind of social issues, right? And they've completely ceded that ground to progressives. And so it's no surprise that progressives have made what's called the long march through the institutions, whether that's the BBC or the universities or wherever else, and completely captured all aspects of the kind of engines of culture, whether that is the entertainment industry or anything else. And so I think that conservatives need to learn from that and need to recognize that if we want to have a good country, we can't just talk about economics all day and leave cultural matters to the left. We have to take an interest in cultural matters, and we have to be prepared to use mechanisms and instruments like the BBC to push our narrative, because our narrative is the right one.
There are two things I can't forgive the BBC for. First is their coverage of Brexit, which was simply astonishing. Second, their coverage of COVID. But in fact, I've thought of a third point as well, which is, as you say, that lack of promoting our culture. They are so very much to blame for, as you mentioned, this sort of lack of cultural awareness, this cultural shame that we see in our generation and across generations really nowadays, which is that our history, our values, our traditions are things of which we should feel ashamed for because of them being intertwined with things that maybe we shouldn't be so proud of in the past. But ultimately, that can't be the way to produce a society which has self-knowledge, self-awareness, and self-respect.
And again, you look at what they are platforming. And I remember when I was a boy, we'd watch Great British Bake Off, every time it was on. And back then, obviously I wasn't thinking about politics and that sort of thing, but it just seemed normal. It just seemed like a nice kind of wholesome baking show. Now, I haven't watched British Bake Off for years, but now if you watch it, a lot of the time, the contestants on there, you'll have a drag queen as one of the contestants. And on Strictly Come Dancing, for example, you'll have, two men as a dancing couple or two women and this sort of thing. And, there's very clearly a radically progressive social agenda that's being pushed by this organisation in a way that is so blatant now that it's no surprise that so many people are switching off.
Yeah, of course. People want to see represented things which they can resonate with. British Bake Off, I agree with you, is a great show. Loved it growing up. Don't watch it now very much. But it would be a real shame if even that has been infected with this need to push an agenda forward, which really has no bearing to the majority of British people.
So I think it's a good thing, in a way, that this story about the Trump clip has been exposed in the way that it has. Because it confirms what so many people already think, which is that they're just out to push an agenda, and they're not afraid of lying in pursuit of that goal. And so I think if anybody who wants the truth and who is interested in the truth should turn off the BBC.
Come to GB News, where Charlie and Alice will give you the truth and the facts. Moving on to our next main topic, I'm very excited to be talking about reform.
Mhm.
Nigel Farage, the momentum, the movement that he's grown, over the last few years. It's astonishing to see reform so high in the polls. Nigel Farage for so long was a figure pretty much despised by the establishment, never platformed, was the laughingstock, frankly. And now he is racing ahead, perhaps even will be the next prime minister. This is an incredibly interesting topic. Charlie and I both have strong views. Let's discuss. Charlie, what do you make of reform and that rise?
Well, he said recently that he is not going to commit to tax cuts and that minimum wage means that certain young people are paid too much. And I don't necessarily disagree with either of those takes. I think that it would be unrealistic to commit to tax cuts at this stage. And the fact that Reeves herself is today having to walk back her own, numerous commitments to not raising taxes on people or on what they call working people, even though they can't define what that actually means. I think it's pretty prudent to not commit to these things. And on the minimum wage question, I do think he is basically correct about that. But more broadly, I mean, we talked last time about the fragmentation of the political landscape. We talked primarily about that happening on the left with the Green Party. And others. And I think it's interesting as well that we're seeing the same thing on the right. I think it's a lot more concentrated on the right because basically everybody is going to reform and the Conservatives are kind of collapsing. But with that being said, I worry that Reform are getting complacent because I think that in a lot of ways they're looking at their commanding lead in the polls and kind of acting like they don't need to do the serious work of preparing to take government. I mean, they've done some fairly good press conferences recently. Danny Kruger and Zia Youssef did one not long ago where they outlined their plans for preparing for government, and it's good to see them thinking in this way. But I have yet to be convinced that they truly understand the gravity of the situation that this country is in. And I think in a lot of ways, Reform is only interested in the public-facing element of politics, which is to say elections, what happens in the House of Commons, what happens on BBC Question Time and this sort of thing. But when it comes to the actual business of government, day to day, and the decisions that are made and who is making those decisions, I'm not convinced that they actually understand what needs to be done. Because we have a civil service in this country that is, constituted of upwards of 500,000 people, which is governed by permanent secretaries that most people don't even know exist, but who actually make a lot of the decisions on a day-to-day basis. And so until I see evidence that they have a not just a plan, but a team of people, possibly 1,000 people, possibly even more than that, who are ready on day one to enter the civil service and replace all of those people who, in many cases, have been responsible for the state of the country today, I'm going to be skeptical. And by the way, on the Conservative Party, I don't think they're fit for government either. I think that both parties are unserious.
Yeah, I think Britain is fundamentally ready for change. I watched Farage's Bloomberg video, and I have to say, I was very taken by his conviction, by the fact that he is a fearless person. And we know this because his track record is of someone who time and time again has stood up for a cause and has been shouted down or made or humiliated by the political establishment. They still use the same tactics today, by the way, which I just find ridiculous. But he is a fearless character. And I think that whilst I share with you some of the broader concerns about what happens on day one, I also feel confident that entrusting someone who I know is at least capable and brave of standing up against the machine. Britain, I think, deserves a leader who is courageous in that respect, rather than the old two political party establishment system. I have to say, this lady is turning.
Well, look, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and defend either the Conservatives or the Labour Party, the Uni Party, because they are both responsible for the dire state of the country today. But with that being said, something else that gives me cause for concern is the fact that, sure, in that Bloomberg interview, and indeed any interview where Farage is taken on by what I would call a regime journalist, somebody who attacks him from the left, as it were, the kind of person that would accuse him of being racist and all this sort of thing. He's great. I mean, and that's because he's been doing it for 25 years, right? But whenever he is interviewed from the right, like by example by Stephen Edgington on this channel, he flounders, because when he's met with questions about demographics, about mass deportations, or about Islam, I don't think he has a good answer. And on all 3 points, these are 3 of the most pressing issues of our time in this country. And if he doesn't have a good answer for those, he might have a good answer for taxes and kind of, that sort of thing. But that's not the only issue. And like and a lot of these issues are very thorny, they're dicey, right? They're not fun to talk about, but they have to be addressed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, going back to taxes, and despite the thorny issues, you agree with the abolishment of the national wage. I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's a necessary safeguard for people who are looking to have some sort of an income. I think it should be definitely there in place. People are choosing to have welfare benefits over an actual job because jobs currently just don't pay enough. The national wage is there so that young people can have recourse to at least some level of income, whether to supplement studies. And I'm sure people older as well, sadly, need that sort of safeguard. So your take on taxes is abolish national wage. And do you agree with Reeves? Do you like the budget?
Well,
personally, my take is that tax hikes are absolutely not the solution right now. We are in a low growth economy. Tax hikes seem to be a plaster issue, providing no sort of energy or focus on the future, which needs to be one in which we can get ourselves out of this mess. I think we need radical economic policy. So in that respect, I'd like to see more of that from reform, because what I see gets us out of the situation is risk-taking and is that courage, even with economic policy. In some ways, I would have liked to see what happened if Liz Truss had been able to get her budget out, because sure, at the time it was considered a bit maniacal, but in hindsight, isn't that so much preferable to this sort of like hiking up taxes, squashing businesses, suffocating young enterprises and individuals? I think that is not what's going to get us out of this really terrible economic situation.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I'd go as far as to say I believe in abolishing the minimum wage, but all I do think is that, one of the roles of government is protecting labour from capital, as it were. And I don't know that having a minimum wage actually does that, because I think it requires businesses to spend there's a certain minimum threshold that they have to spend on their staff, which I think in a lot of cases, rather than making the lot of the staff better, it just reduces the number of staff that they're capable of hiring, which means that those people who they don't hire, who they may have hired if they weren't obligated to pay them a minimum wage, are pushed instead towards the welfare state and towards taking benefits, which is not good for the country and it's not good for that individual either, right? So I'm in two minds about it. I'm not totally committed either way. But when it comes to the general state of the economy, I mean, we're like an almost entirely service-based economy, service-based. Upwards of 90% of our GDP is in services, if I recall correctly. And what does this even mean? It just means like financial services in the City of London, just moving money around. This is not what Marxist economists would call productive labour. We don't make anything. We don't make anything that we can touch with our hands. All of that has been outsourced, offshored to places like China and India and all that sort of thing. And actually the goods that we receive from them in terms of quality are far worse than what we used to create in this country. And so I think any government that wants to put Britain back on the right track economically has to look at that situation and recognize that in order to do that, we have to reindustrialize. And I've seen reform speaking in this language, and I think that's great. I think it's crucial. But that's also going to have to mean, to a certain extent, taking aim at what I would call the capitalist class and not being beholden to the interests of unaccountable multinational corporations and billionaires. I mean, we talked last week about Zach Polanski and the emerging kind of post-woke populist left and their commitment to wealth taxes. And I don't think that will work either, because I think that will force, or it will just cause those with the means to do so to just leave the country rather than paying the wealth tax, which would not be good for anybody. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us today on this second instalment of Radio Britannia. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you will join us next time, where we will discuss all sorts of interesting things, I'm sure.
Absolutely. See you next time. Thank you all very much for tuning in.